Let's read René Girard. This is from his 1999 book, I See Satan Fall Like Lightning. This is from chapter 10 on the uniqueness of the Gospels. To summarize the main point about the Bible and mythology, in the myths, an irresistible contagion compels the unanimous communities to see their victims first as guilty and later as divine. The divine stems from the deceptive unanimity of persecution. In the Bible, by contrast, the confusion of the victimization process in the divine is dissolved and gives way to an absolute separation of the two. As already noted, the Jewish religion no longer turns victims into divinities or divinity into a victim. Monotheism is both the cause and the consequence of this revolution. Then in the Gospels, once again, we find not only the first two stages of the mimetic cycle, but also the third, which the Jewish scriptures dramatically rejected, the divinity of the collective victim. The resemblances between Christianity and the myths are too close not to awaken the suspicion of a fall back into the mythical. Jesus is a collective victim, and Christians see him as the one true God. How do we avoid the conclusion that the affirmation of his divinity has any other cause than that of mythic deities? It is likely that from the beginnings of mankind, all the gods grow out of the single victim mechanism. Judaism conquered this hydra with 1,000 heads. The originality of the Hebrew Bible in relation to the myths is obvious, and it appears to be annulled by the divinity of Jesus. The Christian commitment to the one and only God not only does not resolve everybody's doubts, it often reinforces them. To reconcile the divinity of the biblical Yahweh with the divinity of Jesus, as well as with the Holy Spirit, to whom the Gospel of John explicitly ascribes a role in the redemptive process, the theology of the great ecumenical councils elaborated the concept of the one God as a Trinity. This concept comes across to Judaism as the return of polytheism, now badly disguised. To Muslims also, defining themselves as strict monotheists, are quite clear that in their eyes Christians are lax monotheists at the very least. The same goes for all those who observe Christianity from the outside. From a philosophical, scientific, or even religious perspective, the religious that proclaims the divinity of Jesus Christ gives the impression of being nothing other than a myth that diverse influences have modified, but that is not essentially different from the ancient myths of death and resurrection. Christian dogma has always inspired distrust in Judaism and Islam, and nowadays many Christians are beginning to share that attitude. The cross appears too strange to them, too outdated, to be taken seriously. How could one believe that a young Jew killed nearly 2,000 years ago by a type of torture long since abolished could be the incarnation of the Almighty God? Christianity has been losing ground for centuries in the Western world, a decline that continues to accelerate. Now not only isolated individuals abandon the churches, but entire churches, led by their clergy, switch their allegiance and go over to the camp of pluralism. This pluralism is a relativism that claims it is more Christian than the adherence to dogma because it is kinder and more tolerant toward non-Christian religions. From the perspective of a strict monotheism, therefore, Christianity gives the impression of falling back into mythology. Once again, the single victim mechanism seems to become the source of the divine. But from my anthropological perspective, we can verify that the Gospels maintain the essential victory the Bible achieves, for the relation between victims and persecutors in the Gospels bears no resemblance at all to that of the myths. It is the biblical relation that prevails, the relation we have just discovered in the story of Joseph. Just like the Hebrew Bible, the Gospels defend the victims wrongly accused and expose their persecutors. Jesus is innocent, and those who crucify him are guilty. John the Baptist is innocent, and those who have him decapitated are guilty. The continuity between the Jewish Bible and the New Testament is real and substantial. The refusal to follow Marcion, who wanted to separate the Gospels and the Hebrew Bible, is based on this continuity. Christian orthodoxy affirms that the two testaments are united as part of one and the same revelation. We can well explain the mythic deification of victims by the working of the mimetic cycle, as we have seen. The deification process is based on the capacity of victims to polarize violence, bringing the community together as it transfers its mimetic contagion to the victim. The victim enables the abscess of fixation to function, which reabsorbs and pacifies all the conflicts. If the transference that demonizes the victim is powerful enough, then the reconciliation is so sudden and complete that it appears to be miraculous and triggers a second transference superimposed on the first one, the transference of deification. There's no prior demonization behind the divinity of Christ. Christians don't ascribe any guilt to Jesus. Thus, his divinity cannot rest on the same process as mythic deifications. Moreover, contrary to what happens in the myths, it is not the unanimous mob of persecutors who see Jesus as the Son of God and God himself. It is a rebellious minority, a small group of dissidents that separates from the collective violence of the crowd and destroys its unanimity. This minority group is the community of the first witnesses to the resurrection, that is, the apostles and those who gather around them. This dissident minority has no equivalent in the myths. Around the mythic deities, we never see the community divide into two unequal groups, of which only the smaller one would proclaim the divinity of the god. The structure of the Christian revelation is unique. The Gospels are revelatory in the same way as the great biblical narratives, but even more than this, they go still further in exposing the mythic illusion. We can verify this at several levels. The violent contagion that the myths don't reveal at all is exactly what the story of Joseph and the other biblical texts do reveal to us. They describe it with one word when the narrator accuses the brothers of Joseph of jealousy, for example. The Gospels add to this word the extensive developments that I treated in the earlier chapters. The word scandal articulates for the first time mimetic conflict and its consequences. The figure of Satan, or the devil, is even more revealing. It articulates not only all that scandal does, but beyond that expresses the generative power of mimetic contagion with regard to mythic religion. Nowhere in the world, even in our time, can we find this description of mimetic war of all against one and its effects as complete as the Gospels give. Moreover, they contain unique information about what makes this disclosure possible. In order for a single victim mechanism to be described in a precise and truthful fashion, it must first occur, and in order to occur, it must be unanimous or near unanimous. This is indeed what we find at first in the Passion accounts, thanks to the failures of the disciples. Then there must be a rupture of this unanimity, just small enough not to destroy its mythic effect, but sufficient all the same to assure the revelation that will come and the mission of spreading it throughout the world. This is what occurs in the case of the crucifixion. These requirements must be fulfilled as well in the case of the Old Testament, in the narratives that display the mechanism of violent unanimity. These accounts, however, do not contain any direct information on that point. We can speculate that the notion of a faithful remnant must apply to dissenting minorities, similar to the group of the apostles in the Gospels. However, the Gospel accounts are the only texts in which the rupture of unanimity comes about, as it were, right before our eyes. This rupture is part of the revelation. It is so much more striking that it occurs, as I said, after the failures of the disciples, after the remarkable demonstration of the extreme power of violent contagion even over the apostles, in spite of the teachings and warnings of Jesus. The four narratives of the Passion enable us to see the effects of mimetic snowballing, not only on the Jewish and Roman authorities, but also on the two men crucified with Jesus, and even on the disciples themselves. That is to say, the mimetic escalation affected all the witnesses without exception. Only a few women are not affected, but their witness does not carry the weight of authority in the historical setting. Thus, the Gospels reveal the full and complete truth about the origin of the myth, about the illusory power of mimetic snowballing, about everything that the myths do not and cannot reveal because they are duped by it. This is why I began this book with the explanation or the exploration of ideas drawn from the Gospels, the imitation of Christ, the concept of scandal, and the concept of Satan. Only there could I obtain what I needed to show that the gospel notion of revelation is not at all an illusion or fraud, but a formidable anthropological reality. Most astounding of all, the resurrection and the Christian divinization of Jesus correspond exactly, at the structural level, to the mythic divinization of victims, whose falsity the gospel reveal. Far from transforming or deforming or falsifying, or hiding the mimetic process of the myths, the resurrection of Christ sheds the light of truth on everything that had always been concealed from human beings. Only the resurrection, because it enlightens the disciples, reveals completely the things hidden since the foundation of the world, which are the same thing as the secret of Satan, never disclosed since the origin of human culture, the founding murder and the origin of human culture. The gospel revelation alone has permitted us to succeed in reaching a coherent interpretation of myth and ritual and of human culture in its entirety. I have devoted the first two parts of this book to that work. The resurrection of Christ crowns and finishes both the subversion and the unmasking of mythology, of archaic ritual, of everything that ensures the foundation and perpetuation of human cultures. The Gospels reveal everything that human beings need to understand their moral responsibility with regard to the whole spectrum of violence in human history and to all the false religions. In order for the single victim mechanism to work, as we have seen, their own contagious escalation and the battle of all against one must not be understood by the participants. The mythic process is based on a certain ignorance, or even a persecutory unconscious, that the myths never identify since it possesses them. The Gospels disclose this unconscious not only in the Gospel of John's portrayal of a humanity trapped in the lies of the devil, but in several explicit definitions of the persecutory unconscious. The most important of these we find in the Gospel of Luke, the famous prayer of Jesus during the crucifixion. Father, forgive them because they don't know what they are doing. That's from chapter 23, verse 34. Here, as with all the sayings of Jesus, it is crucial to avoid emptying what he says of its basic sense by reducing it to a rhetorical formula, to a kind of sentimental exaggeration, for example. We should always take Jesus at his word. He expresses the powerlessness of those caught up in the mimetic snowballing process to see what moves and compels them. Persecutors think they are doing good, the right thing. They believe they are working for justice and truth. They believe they are saving the community. We find the same theme in the Acts of the Apostles, also the work of the author of Luke, but in a less striking style. Peter, speaking to those involved in the crucifixion of Jesus, grants them the benefit of extenuating circumstances by virtue of what he calls their ignorance. He says in Acts 3:17, "Now I know, brothers, that you acted out of ignorance, just as your leaders did." What is true of the collective mechanism also holds for mimetic occurrence between individuals. Scandals are above all a kind of inability to see, an insurmountable blindness. The first epistle of John defines them by the darkness that spreads around them. This is from 1 John 2:9-10. Whoever says he is in the light, yet hates his brother, is still in the darkness. Whoever loves his brother remains in the light, and there's no scandal in him. Duping oneself is what characterizes the entire satanic process, and that is why one of the titles of the devil, as I've already mentioned, is the Prince of Darkness. In revealing the self-deception of those who engage in violence, the New Testament dispels the lie at the heart of their violence. It spells out everything we need to reject our own mythic view of ourselves, our belief in our own innocence. The Gospels are well aware of what they are doing. They not only tell the truth about victims unjustly condemned, but they know they are telling it, and they know that in speaking the truth, they are taking again the path of the Hebrew Bible. The Gospels understand their kinship with the ancient scripture regarding the single victim mechanism, and they borrow from it some of its most striking formulations. As I have noted, the narrators of certain psalms are threatened with collective violence. Jesus recognizes and denounces a mimetic contagion of the same type as that which the narrator of this or that psalm had suffered. If we recognize that we are dealing with the same process in both cases, the Gospel's frequent recourse to the Jewish Bible becomes clear. A typical example in the Gospel of John is the way Jesus, soon to be crucified, cites a very simple saying, "They hated me without cause." John 15:25, Psalm 35:19. It appears banal at first, but this sentence expresses the essential nature of the hostility against the victim. The hostility is without any specific reason, precisely because it is the poisoned fruit of mimetic contagion rather than rational motives, or even real feeling among the individuals who feel it. Long before Jesus, the victim who speaks to us in the psalm understood the absurdity of this hatred. It is not at all an exaggeration, and so the expression without cause should be taken literally. The narrators of the Psalms comprehend that the crowd chooses them as victims for motives that are foreign not only to justice, but also to any rational motivation. The crowd does not have a truly personal motive to lay blame on the victim it selects, rather than on some other individual. It has no grievance, legitimate or illegitimate. In a society that has fallen prey to anarchy, the voracious appetite for persecution feeds on victims indiscriminately, as long as they are weak and vulnerable. The least pretext is enough. No one really cares about the guilt or innocence of the victim. These two words, without cause, marvelously describe the behavior of human packs. In the prayers and readings of Holy Week, the psalms in which persecutors are cursed play a major role. The liturgy requires us to reread the complaints of these narrators who are about to be lynched, and it does this to help us better understand the sufferings of Christ, while showing us more ordinary human beings grappling with similar injustice. This injustice is no doubt less than what Jesus suffered, for he is totally devoted to those who persecute him. But the psalm narrators relate human experiences that are close to Jesus' sufferings in the Passion. Modern exegetes don't see the relevance of the close connection between the Psalms and the Passion because they don't understand crowd phenomena in all their violent absurdity. Not perceiving the real violence in the Psalms, they don't understand that the psalm narrators and Jesus are really victims of the same type of injustice. The biblical texts that demystify incidents of contagious escalation in the mimetic war of all against one actually announce or prefigure the sufferings of Christ. We cannot sympathize with these victims without sympathizing equally with Jesus, and vice versa. We cannot despise the sufferings of persons who appear to be the most insignificant, the beggar of Ephesus, for example, without spiritually joining the persecutors of Jesus. We find here the essence of specifically Judeo-Christian prophetic religion. It is closely related to the suffering that all collective persecutions produce. Whatever their date in human history, whatever their ethnic, religious, or cultural attributes of the victims. The modern scorn for the notion of the prophetic, the idea that prophecy is a theological mirage outdated by a scientific method that is necessarily superior to the texts and ideas it studies, is a more terrible superstition than ancient credulity, for its arrogance makes it completely closed to any comprehension. False science is blind to mimetic cycles in general, in the way in which the Bible progressively reveals them from one end to the other. The revelation justifies the idea of Old Testament prefiguration and Christological fulfillment. The Jewish prophets had already proceeded in the same way as the Gospels. To combat the blindness of the crowds and to defend themselves against the hatred directed against their pessimist insight and discernment, they resorted to examples of incomprehension and persecution of which earlier prophets were the victims. Traditional Christian liturgy draws liberally from these texts, whose sensitivity to collective injustice is extremely strong, whereas in philosophical texts it's very weak, and in mythical texts it is null. Seeing as prophetic, the interrelation of all the texts that denounce persecutory allusions is based on a profound intuition of the continuity between the Hebrew Bible and the Gospels. This idea has nothing to do with what passes as prophetic in popular perception, that is, fantastic claims to divination that are common in most societies. When we read a great Christian thinker like Pascal, we find, regretfully, that he conceives prophecy as a kind of mechanical code, a sort of puzzle that only Christians are able to solve because they have the key to it. The Jews, on the other hand, are accounted as understanding nothing about their own texts because they don't possess this key, which is the very person of Christ. But with the mimetic interpretation, it is possible to construe the idea of prophecy in a positive sense just as much for the Jews as for the Christians. This positive sense excludes no one, certainly not the writers of the oldest texts who are prophetically inspired. We can see this in their defense of the innocence of a victim unjustly condemned. To understand prophecy, we must trace it back, like everything that is essential to Christianity, to charity, to concern for the poor, the weak, the disinherited, and the lowly. We must see its place in the parable in Matthew about the final judgment, from chapter 25:40. Truly I say to you, inasmuch as you have done deeds of charity and mercy, No, to one of the least of these my brothers, you have done it to me. The Christian revelation, in its highest sense, is always aware of the biblical revelation that precedes it. It is basically of the same nature and proceeds from the same type of insight. The Christian revelation, in its highest sense, desires to be guided on the basis of the older, related revelation, to be enriched by its treasury of knowledge and its marvelously concrete and picturesque forms of speech. The Old Testament quotations that the Gospel writers strew through their narratives don't seem all equally relevant. Occasionally they seem particularly verbal, devoid of profound meaning, generating artificial correspondences with the Hebrew Bible. But it's a bad idea to condemn Holy Scripture hastily. When we feel like dismissing Scripture, we should watch out. Perhaps we are not, at that moment, up to what our task requires. The Gospel revelation is the definitive formulation of a truth already partially disclosed in the Old Testament. But in order to come to completion, it requires the good news that God Himself accepts the role of the victim of the crowd so that He can save us all. This God who becomes a victim is not another mythic God, but the one true God, infinitely good, of the Old Testament. The divinization of Christ is not based on the illusion of mimetic snowballing, which produces the sacred myth. To the contrary, it is based on the full and complete revelation of the truth that demystifies mythology, and it is this truth, I hope, that nourishes my own analysis from the beginning. Against the mythic deities stands a God who does not emerge from the misunderstanding regarding victims, but who voluntarily assumes the role of the single victim and makes possible, for the first time, the full disclosure of the single victim mechanism. This is not to regress toward mythology. On the contrary, Christianity represents a new stage of the biblical revelation beyond the Old Testament. Far from relapsing into the divinization of victims, in the victimization of the divine that characterizes mythology, as many people inevitably imagine, the divinity of Jesus obliges us to distinguish two types of transcendence, externally similar but radically opposed. The one type is false, deceptive, misleading, and it is the unconscious fulfillment of a victim mechanism. The other transcendence is truthful, luminous. It destroys mythical illusions by revealing how violent contagion poisons communities. It reveals how poison is used to counteract poison, a, quote, remedy to evil whose source is the evil itself. This second transcendence is the true one that begins in the Old Testament and comes to full bloom in the New Testament. The divinity of Christ is fully revealed when He is the victim of the mimetic event of all against one, but it owes absolutely nothing to this phenomenon of violent contagion and scapegoating. To the contrary, He subverts it. To strengthen the preceding argument, I would like now to comment on two passages in the Synoptic Gospels that show not only the deceptive resemblances between the false and the true manifestations of the divine, but something even more remarkable, the existence of an evangelical or gospel knowledge regarding these resemblances and the misunderstandings they entail. For the gospel writers, assimilating the divinity of Christ to a mythic divinization is so impossible that they can present events likely to reinforce this sort of confusion without the least embarrassment or anxiety. If they were nothing but vulgar propagandists, as so many of our experts suspect, then Matthew, Mark, and Luke would never have written the two accounts that I will now discuss. The first passage, quite brief, is in the Gospel of Luke. I have already said that the death of Jesus appeases the multitude. It produces the same effect on the crowd as all collective murders or murders inspired by a crowd, a kind of relaxation of tension, a sacrificial catharsis that prevents the riot that Pilate fears. From the standpoint of the Gospels and Christianity, this appeasement of the crowd has, of course, no religious value. It is a phenomenon typical of violent contagion of human beings who are prisoners of Satan. Instead of confusing and mystifying the process of the victim mechanism, the Gospels demystify it by exposing the purely mimetic nature of what a mythic account would take for divine. The Gospel of Luke contains proof of this, a brief but very revealing indication of demystification. It's a precious bit of evidence for the alert interpreter. At the end of his account of the Passion, Luke adds this observation. At that same day, Herod and Pilate became friends, for before this they had been enemies. According to the Gospel of Luke, Jesus appeared briefly before Herod, and it is their common participation in the death of Jesus that brings Herod and Pilate together. Their reconciliation is one of those cathartic effects. that benefit the participants in a collective murder, the unrepentant persecutors. It is the most characteristic effect of these murders. If it is powerful enough, it leads to the mythic deification of the victim. Luke clearly perceives this effect. He well understands that the improvement of relations between Herod and Pilate has nothing Christian about it. Why then does he go to the trouble of pointing out a detail lacking any Christian value? It's highly unlikely he is interested in Palestinian politics. What does interest him, evidently, is what I'm talking about here, the pacifying effect of collective murder. But why is he, a Christian, interested in this typically pagan reconciliation of the two statesmen? I think Luke points out this reconciliation so that we may recognize something that, viewed from the outside, resembles the effect of the sacrament of the Eucharist among the first Christians, and could be confused with it. He certainly does not confuse the reconciliation of the two representatives of the principalities and powers with what will happen between the disciples and Jesus when the resurrection occurs. It is the paradox of the resemblance between mythical and Christian reconciliation that strikes Luke, and he does not hesitate to report this and does not fear there will be any confusion. That he brings the two resurrections, the true and the false, into contact with one another is a matter of great interest in an intellectual as well as spiritual sense. If we are really faithful to the Gospels, we will not suppress what makes the Passion a single victim mechanism similar to all others. Our taking this mechanism carefully into account does not endanger the Christian theological interpretation of the cross, but strengthens it. The facts and patterns on which mythic deifications are based are all present in the Passion stories, but they are not misunderstood, nor do they go unrecognized as they would in a myth. Rather, they are understood, demystified, and neutralized. Pilate and Herod don't realize, most probably, that their becoming friends again stems from the death of Jesus. Luke possesses the awareness that they lack. Of the four Gospel writers, he is the one who best defines the collective reality of the persecutory unconscious. Now let us turn to the second passage that I wish to discuss, the oldest of the two according to most New Testament scholars, because it is found in the Gospels of Mark and Matthew. It is longer than the first one. It is the account of Herod's false belief in the resurrection of his victim, John the Baptist. This text is a marvelous illustration of the problem of the striking, startling resemblances between mythic resurrections and the resurrection of Jesus. Now, Mark and Matthew, as Christian writers, clearly hold that Herod's belief in John's resurrection is false, whereas Jesus' resurrection is true. What makes this text so extraordinary is that the actual death of John and his false resurrection look from the outside like the actual death and real resurrection of Jesus. From the outside, they seem so much alike that this text in the Gospels is nothing short of amazing for modern readers, whether they are Christian or not. The two beliefs, one true and the other false, both have their roots in one or another of those collective murders, or collectively inspired murders, out of which the mythic gods emerge. In both cases, the adherents affirm the resurrection of a venerated prophet. In both cases, the resurrection appears to spring out of collective violence. The two Gospels put into Herod's mouth a sentence that clearly suggests the origin of his false belief in his obsessive recollection of the murder. "The one I beheaded, this John, he has been raised up." Mark 6:16. This sentence situates the false resurrection in direct continuity with the violent death, which thus appears to be a founding death. It confirms the conception of mythic origins I have proposed in preceding chapters. The entire episode is a mythic origin story in miniature, strangely similar to the sequence of the Passion and the Resurrection. Immediately after Herod's statement, the two Gospels go back in time to recount the murder of John. What justifies the account of the murder can only be the concept to explain Herod's false belief. To give an account of a false resurrection, it is necessary to recognize the collective murder that gives rise to it. How otherwise would one justify the going back in time of the narrative in the two Gospels, which use the technique of the flashback? There is no other example of this in the Gospels. Matthew, even more than Mark, underscores the generative function of the murder in Herod's belief. For Mark, the belief in John's resurrection begins not with Herod himself, but with the popular rumors that Herod believed, and of course, Herod had been fascinated with John. When he heard him, he was greatly perplexed, and yet he heard him gladly, it says. But Matthew doesn't mention the rumors. In his Gospel, the false belief in the prophet's resurrection has no other cause than Herod's participation in John's murder. Matthew and Mark don't say anything to clear up the disarray in which the two resurrections, the false and the true, threatens to plunge so many timid Christians impressed by modern skepticism. Gospel writers obviously do not share the doubts that the resemblance of the two accounts may create for our contemporaries. If these similarities had troubled them, they would have done what Luke did, which is to suppress this episode. It is an episode not centered on Jesus and so plays a secondary role. It could have been easily eliminated. Mark and Matthew have a faith too strong and pure to get worried, as we do nowadays, over similarities between the false resurrection and the true one. It seems that the two writers emphasize these resemblances in order to show the points where the satanic imitations of the truth are most impressive and yet ineffectual. Christian faith consists in this: to think and believe that the resurrection of Christ owes nothing to human violence, by contrast to mythic resurrections, which really stem from collective murders. The resurrection of Christ comes about after his death, inevitably, but not immediately. It happens only on the third day, and if we look through a Christian lens, it has its origin in God himself. What separates the true resurrection from the false are not thematic differences in the drama preceding it, since all this is very similar. The difference lies in the power of revelation. We have already confirmed this power, and we will confirm it again in the chapters to come. It opposes so decisively the power of the mythic cover-up that once we perceive this opposition, the thematic resemblances between myth and gospel fade into insignificance by comparison. Everything that haunts so-called scientific criticism, everything that seems to confirm the skepticism that critics bring with them before beginning their work, comes across as self-fulfilling prophecy, a vicious circle of mimetic illusion. The Gospels always verify, in a marvelous way, all the positions that we adopt regarding them, even those contradicting their true spirit. We can detect a superior irony in these verifications, brilliant in appearance yet illusory, that the Gospels provide for their scientific readers. Luke suppressed the account of the murder of John the Baptist, I believe, because he saw in it a regrettable digression, not because he was troubled by it. His intention was to make Jesus the sole center of his narrative. It could be that in Luke's Gospel the brief mention of the reconciliation of Herod and Pilate is what corresponds to the false resurrection in Matthew and Mark. Belief in the false resurrection is a pagan touch characteristic of representatives of the powers, such as Herod. Luke suppresses it, but he replaces it with another pagan touch of the same type, the reconciliation of Herod and Pilate, as a result of the crucifixion. What the Gospels suggest and reject in both cases is the process of mythic deification. In spite of appearances, the Gospels and their proclamation of the resurrection of Jesus stand in opposition to mythology even more radically than the Old Testament. We see the Gospels giving proof of a knowledge that is dizzying. They dare to draw our attention to the uncanny similarities between the false and true resurrections, because they never doubt, for 1 second, the spuriousness of the one and the reality of the other. Unbelievers, by contrast, confuse the two.